Blessings to all. This message is extremely important. It examines the pandemic from 2020 to 2022 and the coercive measures that were used at this time, and how these coercive measures are correlated with the quickly coming mark of the beast crisis. And before giving this message, I would like to reverently pray. Most gracious and loving Heavenly Father, this is a very sensitive message, but the good news is that this message is not going to be attacking anyone personally for the choices that they've made or didn't make for that matter, but to look at the underpinnings of this pestilence that occurred for 2 years and the measures that were used. And I pray, Heavenly Father, that people will understand that you allowed this to happen to help wake us up to what is quickly coming upon the earth. I pray that all glory and honor be given to you. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. And the title of this message is The Pilot Hole. We see here a picture of President Biden. He was in office during the pestilence 19 pandemic from the year 2020 to 2022. This message is not going to examine any conspiratorial aspects about the pandemic from 2020 to 2022, or to attack or sideline anyone who, through their own choice, decided to get the shot. However, this message is going to look at the coercive measures used during this pandemic and how these coercive measures are actually a prequel to what is quickly coming. That's why the title of this message is The Pilot Hole, because when a carpenter wants to have a screw or a nail go in that much easier, a pilot hole must be created in order to help guide that nail or screw. And the Pestilence 19 pandemic was actually used as a pilot hole to pave the way for what is quickly coming upon us. Before going any further, let us read the third angel's message. And the third angel followed them, saying with a loud voice, If any man worship the beast and his image, and receive his mark in his forehead or in his hand, the same shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is poured out without mixture into the cup of his indignation. And he shall be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment ascendeth up forever and ever. And they have no rest day or night, who worship the beast and his image. And whosoever receiveth the mark of his name, it was already outlined in the previous message as well as what is the mark of the beast, part 5, that the mark of the beast is not a tattoo, a vaccination, or a microchip. It's actually a decision. The received text and the closest English version of the received text, the King James Version, outlines that the mark of the beast is in the hand and in the forehead, but many modern translations of the Bible, including the NIV, replace the word in with on, giving rise to many different interpretations of the mark of the beast, and also having people believe that it could be a mark or something literal on top of the skin. But in the forehead actually has to do with the decision-making center of the brain, the frontal lobe. It was already examined in the previous message, as well as what is the mark of the beast, part 5. This third angel's message is extremely important because after the general close of probation, when the 7 last plagues are being poured out, God's wrath will be mingled with mercy. All the decisions that everyone has made, either to receive the mark of the beast, Sunday worship by law, or the seal of the living God, which is connected to the true Sabbath, these decisions are eternal. It's important to understand this warning because although coercive measures are going to be used to try to get everyone to accept the mark of the beast, these coercive measures have nothing to do with loyalty to God. There have been many martyrs all throughout the Dark Ages, and even Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stood up to King Nebuchadnezzar when he commanded that everyone should bow down and worship the golden image that he made. But they said, We have no need to answer you in this matter, O king. Our God, who we serve, will deliver us. But even if he does not, we will not bow down and worship the image that you have made. Nebuchadnezzar used coercion and a death threat to get everybody to worship the image, but there were 3 Hebrew worthies that stood up at the peril of their lives because they were loyal to God. And the same thing is going to happen in regards to Sunday worship by law. There are going to be coercive measures used to try to get everybody to follow in line. But God's people are going to stand in meekness and humility and courage and not accept the mark of the beast, even in the face of death. And that's why this message outlines the coercive measures that were used during the Pestilence 19 pandemic. These coercive measures are going to be tenfold when the mark of the beast is enforced. But God allowed this to come upon the earth to not only help wake up God's people, but to let us know what is coming. Let us examine our adversary, Satan, the father of lies, the one that actually instigates everything that is going on the earth contrary to the principles of God's government. John 8:44, ye are of your father the devil, and the lust of your father ye will do. He was a murderer from the beginning, and abode not in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaketh a lie, he speaketh of his own, for he is a liar, and the father of it. Revelation 12:9, and the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil, and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world. 2 Corinthians 2 verse 11, lest Satan should get an advantage of us, for we are not ignorant of his devices. This ministry has been raised up by God to help warn his true people in Babylon, loving Catholics and Protestants, about what is quickly coming upon the earth, but to also give them messages of hope and encouragement in regards to victory over sin and reflecting the character of Jesus Christ. But Satan is working overtime to deceive the human race. And one of his greatest deceptions is syncretism, intermingling truth with error in order to deceive souls. Let us now read a quotation from the Great Controversy in regards to Satan as claiming to be the savior of the world and claiming to have the best interest of humanity in hand, when actually he works behind the scenes to destroy humanity. While appearing to the children of men as a great physician who can heal all their maladies, he will bring disease and disaster until populous cities are reduced to ruin and desolation. Even now he is at work, in accidents and calamities by sea and by land, in great conflagrations, in fierce tornadoes and terrific hailstorms, in tempests, floods, cyclones, tidal waves, and earthquakes. In every place and in 1,000 forms, Satan is exercising his power. He sweeps away the ripening harvest, and famine and distress follow. He imparts to the air a deadly taint, and thousands perish by the pestilence. These visitations are to become more and more frequent and disastrous. Destruction will be upon both man and beast. The earth mourneth and fadeth away. The haughty people do languish. The earth also is defiled unto the inhabitants thereof, because they have transgressed the laws, changed the ordinance, broken the everlasting covenant. Satan is responsible for much of the disasters upon the earth. God does allow Satan to do certain things, and God did allow Satan to oversee something that came from the year 2020 to the year 2022, and that was a worldwide pestilence. And this worldwide pestilence was officially deemed to be a pandemic by the World Health Organization, who declares COVID-19 a pandemic. This actually occurred in early 2020. Many people who are going about their everyday lives were shocked to find out that in a moment, the entire world shut down. Let us watch the World Health Organization tell the world about this pandemic.
In the past 2 weeks, the number of cases of COVID-19 outside China has increased 13-fold, and the number of affected countries has tripled. There are now more than 118,000 cases in 114 countries, and 4,291 people have lost their lives. Thousands more are fighting for their lives in hospitals. In the days and weeks ahead, we expect to see the number of cases, the number of deaths, and the number of affected countries climb even higher. WHO has been assessing this outbreak around the clock, and we're deeply concerned both by the alarming levels of spread and severity and by the alarming levels of inaction. We have therefore made the assessment that COVID-19 can be characterized as a pandemic.
It is a big deal when the World Health Organization classifies a disease as a pandemic. Everyday lives were put on hold, and there was the promise that things would return to normal with successive lockdowns, but that obviously didn't work. There was an agenda at play in regards to this pandemic, and the agenda was to take control of the whole world. But luckily, God pulled back the momentum of this pandemic in order to allow his people to get ready for what is quickly coming. God allowed this to happen to wake up his people, but to also let them know the difference between the principles of Satan's kingdom, which is threat, fear, coercion, and God's kingdom, which is righteousness, love, and truth. The Jesuit order was created in the year 1540 to overthrow Protestantism. They work up their way into the echelons of politics. The Jesuit order is a military order. There are many Jesuit priests which practice openly their faith, but there are also Jesuits working in secular and political professions. And the Jesuit order had a huge role in this pestilence for 2 years. And let us read from the great controversy in regards to the Jesuits. Throughout Christendom, Protestantism was menaced by formidable foes. The first triumphs of the Reformation past, Rome summoned new forces, hoping to accomplish its destruction. At this time, the order of the Jesuits was created, the most cruel, unscrupulous, and powerful of all the champions of popery. Cut off from earthly ties and human interests, dead to the claims of natural affection, reason and conscience wholly silent, they knew no rule, no tie, but that of their order, and no duty but to extend its power. The gospel of Christ had enabled its adherents to meet danger and endure suffering, undismayed by cold, hunger, toil, and poverty, to uphold the banner of truth in face of the rack, the dungeon, and the stake. To combat these forces, Jesuitism inspired its followers with a fanaticism that enabled them to endure like dangers and to oppose to the power of truth all the weapons of deception. There was no crime too great for them to commit, no deception too base for them to practice, no disguise too difficult for them to assume. Vowed to perpetual poverty and humility, it was their studied aim to secure wealth and power, and to be devoted to the overthrow of Protestantism and the re-establishment of the papal supremacy. Do you remember in the previous message, Law and Order, there was the outlining of the Roman Catholic social teaching, the common good as it pertains to natural law, that individual thought and freedom is allowed insofar and within due limits that the papal power determines. Freedom of conscience is to be silenced in regards to Roman Catholic thinking. For 1,260 years, from 538 AD to 1798 AD, the Roman Catholic, with its religio-political clout, enforced its dogmatic decrees upon the conscience of the masses, and that included the suppression of freedom of expression when it comes to true Christianity. How much more so now? The papacy wants to regain control of the whole world, and this will occur when the mark of the beast is enforced universally, beginning in the United States. And part and parcel of this new world order, this one government and one world religion, is freedom of conscience. In regards to fundamental Christianity, is deemed to be hate speech. It's deemed to be something that must go. And during the pestilence from 2020 to 2022, there were coercive measures used, pressuring people to take something whether they wanted to or not, but not allowing a fair choice for people who did not want to partake in this agenda. And that's what this message is about. It is not to attack people who took the shot, and it's not to favor people who did not. This message is actually to look at the coercive measures that were used, suppressing freedom of conscience for people, whether they wanted to do something or not. And that's why this ministry has been raised up, is to outline the importance of freedom of conscience, particularly when it comes to the quickly coming mark of the beast crisis. Now let us go back into an encyclical that was written by Pope Francis in 2015, Laudato Si. This was already examined in a previous message, Our Common Home, that there is a climate change agenda as part of the papal momentum to get all religions and all governments on board through climate change. This is the glue that unites everyone together. But there was also something that united everyone together, and that was the Pestilence 19 pandemic from 2020 to 2022. But there was also a link coming from the papal power between this pestilence and climate change. But first, let us read about the Roman Catholic social teaching in regards to the common good from this encyclical, as well as the importance stressed upon Sunday. Just going to read what's highlighted, these key phrases and words: common good, their own fulfillment. Finally, the common good calls for social peace, certain order, society as a whole, and the state in particular are obliged to defend and promote the common good. Please refer to the previous message, the common good. There is a detailed explanation in regards to this social teaching as it pertains to natural law. Human reasoning within the Roman Catholic Church is deemed to be unfallen, even though we have a sinful nature, and the Pope is deemed to be infallible when he speaks on the bishop's seat, and his decrees are irreformable. When the papacy temporarily regains power for a very short time after the enforcement of the mark of the beast, this social teaching will be enforced upon the masses. Freedom of religion, freedom of thought, freedom of expression are limited within due limits according to what the Pope deems to be the common good. And what is the common good in a general way? It's totalitarian fascism. It's actually a compromise between capitalism and communism. Freedom of expression when it comes to Jesus Christ being the only way and the proclamation of the three angels' messages warning about the mark of the beast have no place in this new totalitarian order. The smooth language that is given within the encyclicals may appeal to many because there's so much injustice and inequality in the world. But once the papacy regains control, all of the terms and phrases such as objective moral order, certain order, and within due limits will be fully known to all. It's also mentioned here in paragraph 237, on Sunday, our participation in the Eucharist has special importance. Sunday, like the Jewish Sabbath, it was already outlined in previous messages that the seventh-day Sabbath is not the Jewish Sabbath, it's the Sabbath of the Lord, and it dates all the way back to creation when there were no Jews in the Garden of Eden. But it's going to become clear through the proclamation of this message why Sunday is being highlighted, because during the COVID pandemic, there were many lockdowns and special attention given to Sunday in regards to healing the earth from this virus. Pope says coronavirus pandemic could be nature's response to climate change. The dots are going to be easily connected throughout this message, that there is a direct link between what happened in regards to the pestilence from 2020 to 2022 and the papal agenda to use this crisis to unite all people together, all governments and all religions, to fight together and to come together under the authority of the Holy See. And that includes the coercive measures that were used as it pertains to the common good. Please remember this phrase, the common good. It's going to come up quite a bit during this message. And that the coercion that was used in order to get people to take the shots is linked to a solution for the common good, that everybody can be common together and everybody can be collectively united as a whole. We're all in this together. I'm sure people have heard this many times during the pandemic when they were in supermarkets. Remember, we're all in this together. But people don't realize that the common good is actually linked to principles coming from communism, that individualism has to be thrown aside and subjected to the infallible, unfallen reasoning of the head of the Roman Catholic Church, the Pope. Air pollution falls by unprecedented levels in major global cities during coronavirus lockdowns. Do you remember the initial phase of the lockdowns? Pollution decreased dramatically. People could not leave their homes or go to work. And this was actually used to promote the climate change agenda, to heal the earth of all the pollutants and all of the busyness of life, to give people an understanding that climate change in regards to reducing CO2 emissions, because there were less cars on the road during the lockdowns, It gives favor to the climate change agenda. That was the whole purpose of this pandemic. It wasn't ultimately because of a disease. There are many different tentacles coming from this event that occurred between 2020 and 2022, and climate change is one of those links. Let us watch a short video as regarding the benefits during the initial lockdown phases of the pandemic and how this relates to the climate change agenda.
When we see this kind of profound shutting down of the transportation sector, so much of industry and the broader economy, that does indicate that a lot of critical pollutants are dropping in their concentrations on the order of 30%, say, in some major cities. So we see the air quality rapidly improving in those places. That's a quick, if potentially temporary, response.
Are there specific areas where we have seen marked reductions in the amount of greenhouse gases that are being output as the pandemic has worsened?
Within a week or so of the Bay Area and California, for example, going under a lot of these restrictions, air quality improving by 30% or so. So these are significant. We have seen what look like reductions of 10 to 30% in northeast China and the industrial part of northern Italy. Over as short as like a few week periods, as we started to see the virus really hit and some of these restrictions on people's movement and industry going into place. So the numbers are big.
Are there any historical references that give us like a point of comparison?
Thinking about recent recessions, 2008, we have seen reductions in greenhouse gas emissions when the economy slows down a little bit. In the past, it hasn't generally meant reversals, but noticeable declines. And even if we go back earlier and think about the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Eastern European bloc, there you actually did see reductions in greenhouse gas emissions over 5-year periods or even longer associated with this really kind of cataclysmic reduction in economic activity. So ideally, you don't want to see the reductions, with in emissions accompanying these big recessions and economic suffering. I think there's another path, and really the more effective path in terms of moving the dial is moving towards more energy efficiency and less carbon per unit of economic activity. I think another really interesting question is related to how vulnerable we are as a society to shocks. And I do worry that as we think about climate shocks, whether it's simultaneous crop failures in multiple regions, or a year where we have a big fire season in the western US and a big hurricane in the east, are we as resilient as we think we are, even in the areas that don't get directly affected, right? Because we're all connected.
Did you hear what the gentleman said, that we're all connected and that there were drastic reductions in CO2 emissions during the lockdowns? There is a direct link between what happened during the pestilence for 2 years in regards to a reduction in CO2 emissions and the climate change agenda to enforce a climate Sabbath on Sunday to reduce emissions once per week, to bring down the total amount of CO2 going in the atmosphere by at least 15% to stay within the nominal guidelines, the 1.5 degree threshold, for instance, in regards to global warming, the point of no return. It's not coincidental that this happened. It wasn't just about a pandemic. It's also related to climate change and keeping people at bay, putting restrictions in to prevent people from participating in certain activities for a short amount of time to show the world that it does in fact work. A pilot hole to pave the way for what is quickly coming upon the earth. Sunday worship by law is the mark of the beast, but the first stage of the Sunday law is not Sunday worship. It's Sunday rest. And what is going to be the glue to unite all people to accept Sunday rest by law? Climate change. And there is obviously evidence coming out of the pestilence from 2020 to 2022 proving that taking cars off the road for a short amount of time does in fact reduce CO2 emissions dramatically. But there is also a religious component to the pestilence that occurred. Let's read. National Catholic Register. Is the coronavirus pandemic a judgment from God? All things that God allows or does of his own accord can be deemed judgments. He even allowed Nebuchadnezzar to come upon Jerusalem to take his people captive because they had been disobedient. Nebuchadnezzar wasn't a believer in the one true God at that time, but God allowed Nebuchadnezzar to be used as an instrument as judgment against his people. Everything that is happening right now, in one way or another, can be deemed a judgment, but there is a strong religious affiliation between the pandemic and the papacy, for instance. Let's continue reading. Pope Francis joins Muslim leaders in calling for World Day of Prayer to end the coronavirus. Reading in green, Pope Francis has endorsed the call to the believers of all religions to unite together. Do you remember in 2013 that call, all religions to unite? Spiritually on May 14th in a day of prayer and fasting to implore God to help humanity overcome the coronavirus pandemic. Climate change or a disease affects us all, and this was a method being used by the papal power to unite all people together to overcome this problem. This is part of the New World Order with a one world government and a one world religion, and it takes a crisis to get people to cave. And that's exactly what happened during the pandemic. But also, there are governmental organizations that are directly underneath the papal power. The World Health Organization is one of them. But another more prominent organization is the United Nations. Here's an article. UN Chief Guterres calls for one supreme body of global governance. Is this not a phrase correlating with the New World Order? One supreme body of global governance. Many high-ranking officials within these organizations deemed the pandemic to be a blessing because it exposed the fragility of nationalistic societies all over the world. Nationalism is an enemy to the papacy. They want globalism, and that means multilateral consensus where all countries come together to agree on certain things, and the pandemic was actually used as one of those tools. Let us watch a short video coming from the UN chief and his sentiments in regards to how the pandemic could have been used to unite all governments as one.
The global coronavirus pandemic has exposed the fragility of our world, the United Nations Secretary General says. Delivering a lecture on the occasion of the 102nd birthday anniversary of the late Nelson Mandela, Antonio Guterres said the need for a more equal world is now.
COVID-19 is a human tragedy, but it has also created a generational opportunity, an opportunity to build back a more equal and sustainable world. The response to the pandemic and to the widespread discontent that preceded it must be based on a new social contract and a new global deal that create equal opportunities for all and respect the rights and freedoms of all.
The UN chief calls for the dismantling of structural and systemic barriers, which he says reinforces inequality.
But let's not fool ourselves. The legacy of colonialism still reverberates. We see this in the economic and social injustice, the rise of hate crimes and xenophobia, the persistence of institutionalized racism and white supremacy.
The virtual memorial lecture was organized by the Johannesburg-based Nelson Mandela Foundation. Guterres said people were running out of patience at the glaring disparities and discrimination across societies.
Guterres mentioned some key phraseology in his speech. Equality for all, equal distribution, sustainable development. These phrases are contained in multiple papal encyclicals that have already been examined in previous messages. The agenda of the papacy matches the agenda of the United Nations because the agenda of the United Nations is overseen by the papal power. Now let us examine the common good in more detail in regards to the shots that were offered. L'Osservatore Romano, a conversation with Muhammad Yunus, Nobel laureate and creator of microcredit. Going to read what's highlighted here. There's not enough time to go through all these articles. The vaccine against COVID-19 must be declared a global common good. Once we know where to go, going there becomes much easier. Muhammad Yunus, economist, 2006 Nobel Peace Prize laureate, and creator of modern microcredit, has rather clear ideas about what to do in a world potentially changed by the coronavirus. To begin with, to protect everyone, the entire world from the virus with a vaccine that will be declared a global common good. Then simply to create a very different world. So the shots were actually linked to the common good, and the common good within the Roman Catholic Church is collectivism. There's no individualism. Everybody does what the Pope says, whether they agree with it or not, and that's exactly what happened during the pandemic. There were coercive measures used to get people to do something whether they wanted to or not, while ignoring the freedom of conscience for other people who may not have wanted to take part in it. This is part and parcel of Satan's kingdom. But there is a direct link between the coercive measures that were used to get people to take shots and the global common good, which is linked to natural law within the Roman Catholic Church, stemming out of Greek philosophy that man's reason is unfallen and all goods are for everyone. No one has the right to private property, and that includes freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and ultimately freedom of conscience, apart from the definition of the Roman Catholic Church. Also, during the COVID pandemic, there was talk about the Great Reset, and this is linked to the World Economic Forum. Many people deem that the World Economic Forum is part of the Antichrist system, and it is. And people have called Karl Schwab, for example, the Antichrist, but he's not the Antichrist. These organizations, whether they be governmental bodies such as the World Health Organization, the United Nations, the Center for Disease Control, or even the structural elite in the World Economic Forum, are only organizations that are being run by the papal power. These organizations themselves are not the Antichrist power. However, they do have a part to play in enforcing papal decrees when the situations are opportunistic, which occurred during the pestilence for 2 years. And a term that was floating around during the pandemic was the Great Reset. Now is the time for a Great Reset. What is the Great Reset? It is actually a return to feudalism, and it's linked to totalitarian fascism, where people no longer have private property rights. Business and government are in partnership and control every aspect of life underneath the papacy, and also people do not own anything. Private property is put on the wayside, and one of the phrases of the World Economic Forum is "you will own nothing and be happy by the year 2030. Let us watch a short video in regards to the modern industrial revolution coming from the head of the World Economic Forum, Karl Schwab, and how he deemed that the pestilence was an opportunity for this new industrial revolution to take place.
And the first question is, Dr. Schwab, you developed a terminology called the Fourth Industrial Revolution, which became a global norm for various industrial changes. And you even chose this term as the main theme for 2016 World Economic Forum. So now, under current pandemic situation, what impact did COVID-19 have on the Fourth Industrial Revolution, and how should countries or companies should respond to it?
That's an excellent question. As a reminder, my notion and my book of the Fourth Industrial Revolution is that the innovations we are seeing today in terms of artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, cloud computing, advanced robotics, and many others, together constitute a new phase in human development, on par or even exceeding previous industrial revolutions in scale and impact. COVID-19, if anything, has accelerated this ongoing industrial revolution. If COVID had happened even 10 years ago, we could not have imagined moving entire companies, schools, and government offices so fast online. Today, that is a reality. The Fourth Industrial Revolution has become a reality.
Karl Schwab is hiding the true agenda underneath smooth language. The Industrial Revolution as it pertains to the World Economic Forum is the digitalization of everything on Earth, and that includes human beings. And that means the life of a human being becomes digital. You no longer have individual rights and freedoms. You are actually subject to the system. And the technological advancements he's referring to actually are helping to accelerate this process. The World Economic Forum is already on board for digital IDs and central bank digital currencies. And they've also referred to carbon footprints as it relates to climate change, that you will not be allowed to drive a certain distance. There will be a social credit score, whether you're a good citizen or a bad citizen. And obviously, this is already occurring in China. Do you remember in the previous message, one of the previous messages, there was an examination of China's social credit system, how citizens are deemed to be good or bad depending on their score. And this is exactly what the World Economic Forum would want to implement. But it's not the World Economic Forum ultimately that wants to implement these things. It's the papacy working behind the scenes. Another article, Welcome to 2030. I own nothing, have no privacy, and life has never been better. How could you convince ordinary people to say this phrase so joyfully? Well, obviously, it would take a stupendous crisis and a complete turning around of the economic system we are used to as we know it. And that's exactly what is about to happen after the mark of the beast is enforced. There's going to be a very short amount of time where the new world order will be set up. And people will not have the rights and freedoms that they had beforehand. But over time, given enough psychological warfare, it is possible to train people into believing a lie. It actually worked during World War II. Propaganda was used over and over and over again by Adolf Hitler to convince the German people that the Jews were a problem. And look what happened. And the same thing happened during the pandemic. There was a narrative that people who did not fall in line were not only deemed to be dangerous to society, they should die as well. And there's going to be many articles shown in this message in regards to these sentiments, similar to what happened in Nazi Germany. Here's a short video in regards to the plan coming from the World Economic Forum in regards to the year 2030, the removal of national sovereignty and the subjection of all human beings to a totalitarian fascist regime. Notice the sentiments coming from the World Economic Forum. You'll own nothing and be happy. You will rent. Well, ultimately, renting means that you don't have any private property rights because nothing that you have is your own. It's on a social mortgage. This was already outlined in the previous message, Law and Order, within the Roman Catholic teaching on the common good. Private property has to be put on the wayside. Also, only a handful of nations will dominate. This is related to the New World Order. And climate change is also included in this agenda, a reduction in meat eating, CO2 emissions, as well as the limiting of transportation in regards to fossil fuels. And that is actually being pushed right now. But people may be saying there's no way that these things can happen on a global scale, because although there are many climate activists and there are people that understand that climate change is a problem, we've never seen everybody get together and agree on this at any particular time. Well, it actually did happen for a short amount of time already during the pandemic, but it's going to happen on a greater scale very soon. A huge crisis is just upon us. And the only way that there can be a complete transformation of the economic systems that we are used to right now as we know it would be a complete overhaul of the economy. There has to be an economic collapse, particularly in the United States, because the US dollar is the Federal Reserve currency of the world. Once that topples and becomes integrated into the New World System, things are going to change dramatically, because as we're going to find out in a future message in regards to the New World Order once again, the economy is the foundation of the New World Order. Now let's get back to the message at hand. Pope Francis dreams of post-coronavirus world without inequalities. Pope Francis already wants to engineer a new world order right now. There was already an article outlined that Pope Francis wants a new world order in a post-COVID world. And what does this new world order look like? A one world government and a one world religion with the exclusion of fundamental Christianity and free thought, because free thought is actually linked to hate speech, and we're going to examine that in this message too, that during the pandemic, anything that was deemed disinformation or misinformation through independent media was deemed to be a threat to society. And this is exactly what is going to happen to true Sabbath keepers after the mark of the beast is enforced. Misinformation and disinformation deemed to be a threat to society. That's why God allowed this pandemic to happen, to not only wake up his people, but to let us know what is quickly coming upon the earth. Here's a short video from Pope Francis in regards to his desires for an equal world and the pandemic's use in order to do so.
Puede representar una oportunidad real para la conversión, la transformación, para repensar nuestra forma de vida y nuestros sistemas económicos y sociales, que están ampliando las distancias entre pobres y ricos a raíz de una injusta repartición de los recursos. Pero también puede ser una posibilidad para una retirada defensiva con características individualistas y elitistas.
Do you notice that Pope Francis mentioned individualism and elitism and equal distribution for all? Weren't these sentiments uttered by Guterres from the United Nations in the previous video? Many people may be wondering, well, what does the Roman Catholic Church have to do with the New World Order? It's already been highlighted over several messages. Everything, actually. And the Jesuit order, the military order, works behind the scenes in order to achieve this end. We are about to enter into an extremely difficult time, and I pray for those who are watching to get ready, not through what I say, but through what God says and what God promises for those who put their trust in his Son, Jesus Christ. Here is from Laudato Si once again in regards to Sunday. On Sunday, our participation in the Eucharist has special importance. Sunday, like the Jewish Sabbaths. There's no such thing as the Jewish Sabbath. Although the Sabbath was given to the Israelites at Mount Sinai through the Ten Commandments, God outlines in the fourth commandment that he created the heaven and the earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed from all the work that he had done, going back to creation in Genesis chapter 2. It's not the Jewish Sabbath, it's the Sabbath of the Lord. But the reason why Sunday is being highlighted again is because all throughout the pandemic there was special importance placed upon Sunday when it came to lockdowns and trying to alleviate the pressures that people were facing because of the virus. Here we have an article from Canada. Premier orders most Quebec stores closed Sundays to give workers a break. This was during the pandemic. Many laws right now are on the books to close stores on Sundays, but there's been so much pushback against it. But bring a crisis in, things change, and that's exactly what happened here. COVID-19, Kerala witnesses total shutdown during Sunday lockdown imposed amid rising cases. Sunday lockdown in Guadalupe extended. Now, why was there so much focus upon Sunday during the pandemic? Because it's part and parcel of the papacy's agenda to enforce Sunday worship by law, and it begins with Sunday rest by law, a climate Sabbath for the environment where all people can come together regardless of their religious worldview or absence of religious worldview for that matter, to work as a team to overcome this problem. And that's exactly what happened during the pandemic. Regardless of your worldview, it affected us all. And these are glues that are being used to unite all people, but also the enforcement of the Roman Catholic social teaching on the common good reigned supreme during the pandemic. Coercive measures used in order to get people to do something, whether they wanted to or not, and not allowing people to make up their own mind, and hiding the truth in regards to certain aspects about the virus in the mainstream media, and then accusing people for bringing up these gaps on independent media and calling this misinformation and disinformation and a threat to society. These sentiments are going to be even louder during the Mark of the Beast crisis. God's true people are going to be deemed terrorists, and a death decree eventually will be enforced against them because they will be deemed terrorists. What they say will be deemed misinformation and disinformation. Now let us once again examine papacy's view on civil and religious liberty, because during the pandemic, civil and religious liberty was suspended in many areas of the world, and particularly we are going to examine one area of the world, the United States, because once the Constitution in the United States, which guarantees freedom of expression, free speech, and freedom of conscience when it comes to medical choices, once this is destroyed, then the New World Order can be set up and the papacy can have control. From the Great Controversy, the Constitution of the United States guarantees liberty of conscience. Nothing is dearer or more fundamental. Pope Pius IX, in his encyclical letter of August 15, 1854, said, "The absurd and erroneous doctrines or ravings in defense of liberty of conscience are a most pestilential error, a pest of all others, most to be dreaded in a state." The same Pope, in his encyclical letter of December 8, 1864, anathematized those who assert the liberty of conscience and of religious worship. Also, all such as maintain that the Church may not employ force. Coercion is a form of force. Maybe not direct physical force in some cases, but you are forced into making a choice, correct? When you are coerced to do something, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, if you bow down and worship the golden image I have made, then well. But if not, let it be known unto you that you will be thrown into the burning fiery furnace. That's a death threat. Coercion. Make your choice. Do you want to live or do you want to die? This happened during the pandemic. People were pressured into choosing between keeping their job and going without food because they wouldn't be able to make a living. This is exactly what happened during this pandemic, and these principles don't come out of the American Constitution. They come straight from the Roman Catholic Church and ultimately from Satan himself, because he uses fear, coercion, and force to garner his ends. Here's an article in regards to a prayer offered by a bishop in the United States, and listen to the phrases uttered by this man. "Bless us, citizens of the United States of America. Grant peace and prosperity to our nation. Illuminate those who govern us so that they may commit themselves to the common good in respect for your holy law. Protect those who, defending the inviolable principles of the natural law and your commandments, must face the repeated assaults of the enemy of the human race." This was during the pandemic, and the bishop is outlining the Roman Catholic social teaching of the common good, which means that the common good was actually being enacted in the United States during the pandemic. This is going to be outlined clearly. And how clearly? Let's read this article. Analysis. Biden's war on virus becomes war on unvaccinated. Reading in green. We've been patient, but our patience is wearing thin. Biden said from the state dining room, and your refusal has cost all of us. The unvaccinated minority, he added, can cause a lot of damage. And they are. Another article. Hannity hits Biden's new vaccine mandates. You will be canceled in society altogether. Are these principles stemming from the American Constitution in regards to freedom of conscience? This message is not to sideline those who took the shot or favor those who did not. This is to outline the coercive measures that were used during the pandemic to pressure people into doing something whether they wanted to or not. And this is the ultimate issue at hand. These principles that were enforced during the pandemic in the United States are directly linked to what is going to be enforced after Sunday worship by law is mandatory in this nation. Also, if somebody in a regular medical sense is vaccinated and protected from the virus, why would a non-vaccinated person be a threat to a vaccinated person? This doesn't seem to make sense. Biden declares sweeping new vaccine mandate. This is not about freedom. This should have been an alarm bell for God's people, because the United States is about freedom when it comes to freedom of conscience. In any given situation, people should be able to make an informed choice for themselves in regards to their medical health, whether they want a vaccine or not. Many people during the pandemic wanted to take the vaccine because they thought it was the best thing for them to do, and that should be respected as their choice. But what about the people that chose not to? This group of people were sidelined as being a threat to those who were vaccinated because they were unvaccinated, but also putting an economic drain on society, particularly when it came to the health care system. Here's a short video of President Biden's sentiments in regards to the unvaccinated, and ultimately nullifying the principles of the American Constitution when it comes to freedom of conscience in regards to somebody's personal medical choices, particularly when it comes to putting something inside their body.
If we raise our vaccination rate, protect ourselves and others with masking, expanded testing, and identify people who are infected, we can and we will turn the tide on COVID-19. It'll take a lot of hard work. It's going to take some time. Many of us are frustrated with the nearly 80 million Americans who are still not vaccinated, even though the vaccine is safe, effective, and free. While the vaccines provide strong protection for the vaccinated, we read about and hear about and we see the stories of hospitalized people on their deathbeds among the unvaccinated over the past few weeks. This is a pandemic of the unvaccinated. The unvaccinated overcrowd our hospitals, are overrunning emergency rooms and intensive care units, leaving no room for someone with a heart attack or pancreatitis or cancer. This is not about freedom or personal choice. It's about protecting yourself and those around you, the people you work with, the people you care about, the people you love. My job as president is to protect all Americans. So tonight, I'm announcing that the Department of Labor is developing an emergency rule to require all employers with 100 or more employees that together employ over 80 million workers to ensure their workforces are fully vaccinated.
President Biden implemented stronger measures throughout his presidency as the months went by during the pandemic. But do you remember his sentiments? This is not about freedom or personal choice. What does that do to the American Constitution when it comes to personal choices in regards to somebody's health? Obviously, a crisis came in, and this crisis superseded and suspended the American Constitution. The same thing occurred in Australia, Canada, China, for instance. Many of these countries instituted drastic measures against the virus, and many rights and freedoms contained within these nationalistic countries were suspended. And this is exactly what is about to happen with the mark of the beast. The American Constitution is going to be suspended. The crisis is going to be so grave, so detrimental to Americans, that there's going to be a clamoring for a solution, and that clamoring is going to be a willingness to throw away personal rights and freedoms for the benefit of all. Aren't these the sentiments coming from the Roman Catholic Church to create the crisis? Do you remember in the message, the Cosmic Christ, that in order for the Cosmic Christ to appear, there must be so much friction in society that a great crisis comes upon us where everybody is willing to work together, finally, regardless of their beliefs, regardless of how painful it is to come together? Because the pain of coming together is far less than the pain of remaining apart. And that's exactly what happened during the pandemic. What about somebody's personal choice who has a strong immune system to not take the shot versus somebody who has a weak immune system and decided to take the shot? Aren't these both valid situations on either side of the coin where somebody could make a proper choice for their health? This is not to sideline those who took the shots or to favor those who did not, but to look at this in an individualistic way. Depending on the person during the pandemic, their personal choice could have been made for the best suitable situation depending on who they were. But the narrative during the pandemic was only supporting one side. And it wasn't necessarily only supporting one side, it was coercing people to go onto that side regardless of the medical information that was coming out that was suppressed by the mainstream media in regards to natural remedies and immunology, the body's ability to fight the virus without a shot. And that is going to be outlined as we continue now. Fauci, no doubt, Trump will face surprise infectious disease outbreak. And this was in 2017, right when President Trump took office. And how would Dr. Fauci, who was a mainstream figure during the pandemic, know that Trump would face a surprise infectious disease outbreak 3 years before it happened? Well, obviously, there are people working behind the scenes that plan these events. And Dr. Fauci obviously was in the know in regards to the beginning of this pandemic, which means ultimately that he would either A, be working for the powers that be within the Roman Catholic Church, the Jesuit order in particular, or he would directly be one of those people himself. Jesuits necessarily don't have to wear a Roman Catholic garb to be deemed a Jesuit. They can be deemed a short-robe Jesuit. They could be within their secular profession doing what the Jesuits want them to do. But once again, how did Dr. Fauci know that there was going to be an outbreak 3 years after this article was written? Well, let us continue examining. Dr. Fauci warns of a new smoldering threat. Going to read this article. Despite nearly 70% of Americans being fully vaccinated, things aren't looking good for the end of the COVID-19 pandemic. Too many people are unvaccinated. Many of them will catch and spread the virus. The virus could mutate into something far worse. The chief medical advisor to the president and the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases appeared on MSNBC's All In with Chris Hayes yesterday to sound the alarm. If you've been vaccinated or haven't, you need to hear these 5 points, which could save your life. Read each of them, and to ensure your health and health of others, don't miss these sure signs you have long COVID and may not even know it. How are the unvaccinated a threat to the vaccinated? Well, obviously, even if the unvaccinated weren't a threat to the vaccinated, the virus wouldn't be eradicated. So what would have been the solution? Well, obviously, Dr. Fauci says that everybody would need to be vaccinated. But is this logical? Not everybody can safely take inoculations, regardless of what pressures are coming upon them. And it's also going to be outlined at the end of this message that there was hypocrisy within the pandemic. There were certain groups of people that were excluded from having to take the shot, yet the narrative was everybody takes the shot. This has to do with an autocracy, where there was one ruler and everybody else does what he says. But ultimately, for peasants, the middle class, ordinary citizens, they will do what they're told, and special people within the elite class don't have to do what they're told. And this is exactly linked to what is quickly coming upon the earth. A few people will be favored at the top, the elite, and everybody else will be slaves. And that's exactly what happened during the pandemic. But it was already mentioned earlier. In a certain situation, there could be person A who has a weak immune system, and he or she decides to take the shot to boost their immune system. That's their choice. But what about somebody who has a strong immune system, is young and in good shape, and decides to either A, trust their immune system to the virus and not get it, or B, get the virus and then develop the antibodies by being sick by the virus and then not getting sick again because they've got the antibodies? This narrative was not part and parcel of what was being given to us during the pandemic. And here is a very compelling video where a senator is actually talking to Dr. Anthony Fauci about omissions during the pandemic in regards to the true science surrounding immunology.
But she's had the flu for 14 days. Should she get a flu shot?
Well, no. If she got the flu for 14 days, she's as protected as anybody can be, because the best vaccination is to get infected yourself.
And
So
she should not get it?
if she really has the flu, she definitely doesn't need a flu vaccine. If she really has the flu,
She should not get it again?
no, she doesn't need it, because it's the most potent vaccination is getting infected yourself.
This is an ongoing question, and we've had ever-evolving opinions from you, Dr. Fauci. Currently, antibody surveys show that 80% of children, approximately 80% of children, have had COVID, and yet there are no guidelines coming from you or anybody in the government to take into account their naturally acquired immunity. You seemed quite certain of yourself in 2004, but in 2022, there's a lot less certainty. One of the things that we also know after looking at this for 2 to 3 years is that the mortality from COVID is very similar, if not less, than influenza. So when we look at this, we wonder, why you seem to really embrace basic immunology back in 2004 and why you seem to reject it now.
Well, I don't reject basic immunology, Senator, and I have never denied that there is importance of the protection following infection. However, as we have said many times, and as has been validated by the authorization by the FDA through their committee and the recommendation by the CDC through their committee, that a vaccination following infection gives an added extra boost. And that film that you showed is really taken out of context. I believe that was when someone called in who had had a reaction to a vaccine and asked me through a telephone in the interview if they should get vaccinated again. So it was in the context of someone who had a reaction. And as a matter of fact, Reuters fact check looked at that and said, Fauci's 2004 comments do not contradict his pandemic stance.
Actually, words don't lie. If you look at the words behind me, we can go over them a little bit at a time. She doesn't need it because the most potent vaccination is getting infected yourself.
It is true. It is true, Senator. It is a very potent way to protect.
So when you're trying to tell us that kids need a third or a fourth vaccine, are you including the variability or the variable of previous infection in the studies? No, you're not. Because when you have approved vaccines in recent times, and the committees that have approved it for children don't report anything on hospitalization or death or transmission. Right. They only report that if you give them the jab, they'll make antibodies. And you can give kids hundreds of jabs and they'll make antibodies every time, but that does not prove efficacy. Okay. So what you're doing is denying the very fundamental premise of immunology that previous infection does provide some sort of immunity. It's not in any of your studies. Almost none of your studies from the CDC or from the government have the variable of whether or not you've been previously infected. So let's look at adults. I've had 3 infections. Should I get a 4th one? If you're going to measure whether I get a 4th one, you need a category that has a 4th one in it, and you need one that has nothing in it, no vaccine or the 4th vaccine. But you also need to know whether they've been infected. If you ignore whether they've been infected, you're ignoring a vaccine, basically, so you're ignoring a variable. So what you're giving us is you decry, and people decry vaccine hesitancy. It's coming from the gobbledygook that you give us. You're not paying attention to the science. The very basic science is that previous infection provides a level of immunity. If you ignore that in your studies, if you don't present that in your committees, you're not being truthful or honest with us.
Senator, if I might respond, I have never, ever denied fundamental immunology. In fact, I wrote the chapter in the textbook of medicine on fundamental immunology.
Any of the guidelines for vaccines, do any of the guidelines for vaccines from the government include previous infection as something to base your decision-making on with vaccines? Do any of the guidelines involve previous infection? That's why you're ignoring previous infection, because it doesn't involve any of the guidelines.
Was the narrative during the pandemic fair? Because some valid points were made here when Anthony Fauci was being questioned. Being infected by a virus gives a strong antibody response, which means you'll be way less likely to contract that same form of the virus after you've been infected. But was this included as part of the narrative when the coercive measures were given? No. It didn't matter if you had a previous infection. This is not to sideline people who took the shot or favor those who didn't take the shot, or to sideline those who didn't take the shot and favor those who took the shot. This has to do with freedom of conscience when it comes to an individual. Let's say you're an 80-year-old woman and your immune system is failing. For that particular situation, it could be a good idea to make a choice to get the shot to develop antibodies. But what about a 25-year-old who is in perfect health? Maybe for that individual, it would be just as good of a choice not to get it. But when it came to the narrative during the pandemic, it was only one-sided. Studies of immunology for previously infected patients was not included as part of the narrative. The unvaccinated were deemed to be a threat to society. It's important to understand that regardless of whether or not people got the shot or they did not, it has nothing to do with the coercive measures that were used during the pandemic stemming from the papal power from Satan himself to pressure people to do something whether they wanted to or not. This has to do with the common good. It has to do with totalitarian fascism, where individualism, a person's own choice when it comes to their medical decisions. This was thrown aside during the pandemic, and these when it comes to individuality, when it comes to the mark of the beast, it's going to be the same thing. People who choose to hold to the Sabbath day of the Lord, the seventh day, are going to be deemed a threat to society, and there is going to be a negative narrative placed against them. Having SARS-CoV-2 once confers much greater immunity than a vaccine, but vaccination remains vital. This seems to be a contradictory statement that there is much greater immunity if you had the disease without the shot, but the vaccination remains vital. This was part and parcel of the narrative. Now, let us get into the propaganda that was used during the pandemic to sideline people who did not follow the protocol in regards to the narrative. You are going to see a lot of sentiments coming from government and people similar to what happened during World War II in regards to Adolf Hitler, when the Jews were singled out as a threat to society and eventually they had to be murdered and put away. This language is extremely violent, but it is also a warning as to what is quickly coming upon us when God's people do not accept the mark of the beast and they remain true to God. These sayings are going to be repeated, but there's also eventually, after the no buy, no sell decree, a death decree coming. We need to be prepared. For those who are listening, loving Catholics and Protestants, living up to the light that you have, time is running out. We need to be in a steadfast relationship with Jesus now. He is pleading. The Holy Spirit is knocking on the doors of our heart to accept him in fully, to come out of Babylon and stand with God's true people, whether we live or die. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau calls the unvaccinated misogynistic and racist extremists. Francis Macron sparks outrage as he vows to annoy the unvaccinated. Rants Governor Inslee stoops to a new low, says COVID unvaccinated are domestic terrorists. Teachers Union officials' Facebook post says people with religious vaccine exemptions deserve to die. Suggests GOP commit mass murder. Edge of a cliff. I'm terrified I could die in months because selfish anti-vaxxers are stopping me from getting life-saving transplant. Breaking. Biden administration making lists of religious vaccine objectors, similar to what Adolf Hitler did with the Jews. Utah newspaper pushes for National Guard to block unvaccinated from socializing. Isn't this what happened to the Jews in Nazi Germany? The same type of measures? In disturbing experiment, Americans signed petition to arrest and jail all unvaccinated adults. Fauci tells Americans to disinvite unvaccinated family from Christmas as Omicron spreads rapidly and U.S. records daily 172,072 cases. Free speech labeled as terrorism threat by U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Going to read in green. DHS alleges that there have been allegedly misleading reports about COVID-19 mandates or vaccines targeting alternative media. Now, what is this alternative media? Independent media, not mainstream media, which means that those who are speaking out against the narrative and promoting freedom of conscience for all were deemed to be a threat to national security. But ultimately, free speech was labeled as a terrorism threat. Doesn't this fly in face of the American Constitution, which guarantees free speech? But during the pandemic, free speech in the United States was deemed to be a threat to Homeland Security. God is telling us something. This means that during the Mark of the Beast crisis, free speech is going to be a threat to Homeland Security. And who is going to determine what free speech is? Obviously, there is going to be a certain type of speech which is going to be deemed hate speech. Free speech in a sense of independent media. There will be an effort to suppress these alternative ways at looking at the narrative. Freedom is a threat to national security, potential terror threats, opposition to COVID measures, claims of election fraud, belief Trump can be reinstated, and 9/11 anniversary and religious holidays. But opposition to COVID measures was a number one terror threat in the United States, and that would include people who wanted to stand up against the narrative and ask that all people have free choice in regards to their medical decisions. Now let us go back to the papacy in regards to the involvement that they had in regards to the shots. Pope denounces fake news about COVID. Vaccines, urges truth. Pope Francis is denouncing the fake news about COVID-19 and vaccines, blasting what he says is a distortion of reality based on fear. Now, what is fake news? Well, obviously, during the pandemic, fake news was not the mainstream media narrative. Fake news is independent media narratives. Those who are looking at the situation and coming to their own conclusions and expressing their concerns. Isn't this guaranteed in the American Constitution? But during the pandemic, the American Constitution was suspended in so many ways, and if it wasn't for God's mercy, it would have been suspended even more. He pulled back the restrictions in early 2022 to give God's people a chance to get prepared for the Mark of the Beast crisis, but to also warn us of what is quickly coming, tenfold once again. Pope Francis says getting vaccinated is an act of love. Now, depending on the situation, this is a true statement. There's nothing wrong with this statement. We'll go back to the scenario. You have an 80-year-old woman who has a weak immune system, and she wants to see her family members. So she decides to get vaccinated to build up antibodies so she can be healthy in the face of the pandemic. But what about the 25-year-old male that is in really good shape and doesn't feel he needs the shot in order to have immunity? Obviously, getting vaccinated as an act of love was one-sided during the pandemic, because not being vaccinated, obviously, according to Pope Francis, would not be an act of love. It would be an act of hate. Here is a short video in regards to his sentiments.
Gracias a Dios y el trabajo de muchos, hoy tenemos vacunas para protegernos del COVID-19. Ellas traen esperanza para acabar la pandemia, pero solo si están disponibles para todos y si colaboramos unos con otros. Vacunarse con vacunas autorizadas por las autoridades competentes es un acto de amor, y ayudar a que la mayoría de la gente lo haga es un acto de amor. Amor a uno mismo, amor a los familiares y amigos, amor a todos los pueblos. El amor es también social y político. Hay amor social y amor político. Es universal, siempre desbordante de pequeños gestos de caridad personal capaces de transformar y mejorar las sociedades. Vacunarse es un modo sencillo pero profundo de promover el bien común y de cuidarnos unos a otros, especialmente los más vulnerables. Le pido a Dios para que cada uno pueda aportar su pequeño grano de arena, su pequeño gesto de amor. Por más pequeño que sea, el amor siempre es grande. Aportar esos pequeños gestos para un futuro mejor. Que Dios los bendiga y muchas gracias.
Another aspect of vaccination when it comes to Pope Francis' sentiments is he believed that getting vaccinated is an act of love. But what about the potential side effects of the vaccines for certain age groups and certain people? Would it be an act of love for somebody to take something that could potentially harm their body? That wouldn't be an act of love because they have people that love them. This was a one-sided narrative. The act of love had to do with those that chose to do something, and an act of hatred would be with those who chose not to do it, and that's exactly what happened during the pandemic. This is not to favor those who took the shot and sideline those who didn't, or favor those who didn't take the shot and sideline those who did. This is about freedom of conscience. It's about personal individual choice, but during the pandemic, personal individual choice had to be suspended, linked to the American Constitution, where every individual has the right to freedom of expression, religion, and also choices in regards to their medical health. But that was suspended during the pandemic because, according to the papal hierarchy, it's not individualism that is part of the New World Order. It's collectivism, where everybody works together as a harmonious unit, not as individuals with their own mind and their own thinking, but doing what is ordered of them, whether they agree or not. And any cell that dares to stand up within the collective hive must be snuffed out. And that's exactly what is about to happen in regards to the Mark of the Beast crisis. God's people, his true people who hold true to him, and the Sabbath, the seventh day of the week, being a mark of his authority, as opposed to the mark of the beast, Sunday being the mark of Satan's authority. There is going to be one final short clash, and both characters will be fully revealed. Those who accept the mark of the beast after the general close of probation will reflect the character of Satan fully, and those who receive the seal of the living God to go through the time of trouble such as never was after the general close of probation will be reflecting the character of Christ fully. Obviously, this war is between Satan and Jesus Christ, good and evil. It's over individualism versus collectivism, because in Satan's kingdom, individualism is a threat. Why? Because we are saved as individuals when it comes to our relationship with Jesus Christ. But according to the Roman Catholic Church, it's collectivism, it's group association, not your individual thought processes. True love is without hypocrisy, Romans chapter 12, verse 9. Let love be without dissimulation, which is hypocrisy. Abhor that which is evil, cleave to that which is good. There was a lot of hypocrisy during the pandemic, and God outlines in his word that true love, whether somebody chose to take the shot or not, should be without hypocrisy. It should be made on a sound personal choice. So what about the hypocrisy that occurred during the pandemic? Here is an important article outlining the hypocrisy. Members of Congress and their staff are exempt from Biden's vaccine mandate. So on the one hand, people were told that everybody had to be vaccinated in order for the pestilence to go away. And that meant everybody. But there were certain people that were excluded from the mandate. So this seems to be contradiction, correct? How can there be a narrative that everybody must be vaccinated, but at the same time there are special groups of people that don't have to? This is part and parcel of the New World Order, that there's special people that are favored in certain circumstances, but the rest of the average people, the peasants, the pawns, the cattle, the sheep, have to do what they're told. There were certain people during the pandemic that were free from having to make that difficult choice because they didn't have to be coerced into doing it whether they wanted to or not. But here we see that there was hypocrisy because on the one hand, everybody has to get inoculated, and if everybody is not inoculated, the pandemic can't come to an end. But on the other hand, not everybody has to get inoculated because there's certain groups of people that are favored. In God's kingdom, there's no hypocrisy. When God gives an order, people obey, not because they're coerced to, not because they're afraid of him, not because they want reward, but because they love him. And during the pandemic, true love was absent, at least when it came to the narrative through the mainstream media. To close this message from mind, character, and personality. Cast out of heaven, Satan set up his kingdom in this world, and ever since he has been untiringly striving to seduce human beings from their allegiance to God. He uses the same power that he used in heaven, the influence of mind on mind. Men become tempters of their fellow man. The strong, corrupting sentiments of Satan are cherished, and they exert a masterly, compelling power. Under the influence of these sentiments, men bind up with one another in confederacies, in trade unions, and in secret societies. There are at work in the world agencies that God will not much longer tolerate. High echelons within the occult world were part and parcel of administering this pandemic, particularly when it comes to the Jesuit order. Can this be proven? Absolutely not. There's no way that this can be proven. But through faith in God's word and the spirit of prophecy, this is exactly what is happening. There have been statesmen, even in China, in ancient writings after the Jesuit order was formed. I stand here on this balcony, ruling the world, and nobody knows how I do it. And this actually came from a Jesuit. I pray that this message has been helpful. This message was not to attack those who are inoculated with the Pestilence 19 vaccines, to favor those who are not. It is simply to outline the coercive measures that were used and the one-sided narrative that was promulgated, particularly when it comes to immunology. The traditional belief that whether somebody chooses to get an inoculation or not, depending on the situation, it may be better for somebody to do so in their situation, and it may be just as good not to do so in another situation. This is known as individual choice, but obviously individual choice was thrown aside. And this ultimately is to link this, what happened during the pandemic, with what is quickly happening in the world in regards to the Mark of the Beast crisis. It's the 20th of January 2025, and President Trump has just been sworn in for his second term. Momentous and perilous times are ahead of us, and I pray for those who are watching, loving Catholics and Protestants, that the Holy Spirit inspire you and encourage you and convict you that it's time to come out of this system. It is now time to close in prayer. Most gracious and loving Heavenly Father, I pray this message has been simply explained without going into the conspiratorial aspects of the pandemic, but to get right down to the nitty-gritty in regards to the coercive measures that were used coming from the Papal See, coming from Satan himself, and the one-sided narrative that was used. Your kingdom is fair. You tell us in Isaiah chapter 1 verse 18, come, let us reason together. And that wasn't allowed during the pandemic. People weren't allowed to make their own personal choices. And if they did make their own personal choice, there were coercive measures on top of that, whether they wanted to or not. I pray also, Heavenly Father, that we wake up to the realization that what you allowed in a micro sense from 2020 to 2022 is going to become a macro after the mark of the beast is in force, because the narrative that was placed against the unvaccinated during this pandemic will be similar to the narrative placed against Sabbath keepers after the enforcement of Sunday worship by law. I pray all glory and honor be given to you. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.